years later, in 1893, they formed a new lodge in which they initiated about a dozen women. And that lodge was the beginning of co-masonry, of masonry that admits both women and men. Now, in the year 1902, this is just 9 years after the beginning of French co-masonry. And this was exclusively French, all right? It had spread to French-speaking Switzerland and Belgium, but it was entirely French. But in 1902, an Englishwoman by the name of Annie Besant went to Paris and got herself initiated into co-masonry. Now, Annie Besant was a perfectly remarkable person. She became Madame Blavatsky. Betty mentioned Madame Blavatsky as one of the founders of the Theosophical Society, and she was, in a way, the chief idea person behind the society. Annie Besant became Madame Blavatsky's intellectual and spiritual successor. Eventually, she became international president of the society after Colonel Alcott died in 1907. But in 1902, she went to Paris, got herself initiated into Freemasonry. She had been a really active woman in all sorts of ways. She had gotten herself elected to the London School Board. She had gone to the University of London, which was one of the, probably at the time, the only English university which admitted women at all. She studied chemistry. She never got her degree because the examiner, her examiner, when it came up for her degree examination, said he would never approve a woman. And so she never got her degree. She was a brilliant woman. She became the best-known woman orator in England during her lifetime. She was a labor organizer. She organized the first strike of women workers in England. They were called match girls. And they spent their lives taking little strips of wood and dipping them into noxious chemicals to make matches out of. It was a very dangerous and unhealthy activity. And she organized a strike of them to improve working conditions for the match girls. She also got put into jail for selling a book which advocated and explained methods of birth control. The book was called The Fruits of Philosophy, and I have a copy of it, and I do not recommend it. If anyone relied on it, they'd be in big trouble. But they didn't have much to go on in those days. Okay, so she was a really activist person. She had been invited into Freemasonry by a friend of hers who was already a member of the French order of co-masons. And she had refused it because she thought Masonry, looking at Masonry in England, she thought Masonry was something that upper-class snobs did. And she was all for the rights of the common person, right? So she had rejected it. But finally she decided there is something in this. So she went, she got initiated in Paris, she came back, and in 1902 she formed in London the first English-speaking co-Masonic lodge in the world. And then she went to India the following year, 1903, and in Benares, she and the woman who had gotten her into co-masonry, whose name is Francesca Arundel, and Miss Arundel's nephew, George Arundel, the three of them formed what was called a Masonic triangle in Benares, which was the beginning of a lodge, a Masonic lodge. And that was the first lodge in the English-speaking world. You do understand that India is English-speaking, right? At least all the educated Indians speak English and did then too. The first lodge outside England in the English-speaking world, which admitted women. So that was the beginning of co-masonry. Now, the attitude of co-masons, Co-masonry works essentially the same degrees that are worked in masculine masonry. Craft degrees, Scottish Rite degrees, York Rite degrees. There are, if any of you are masculine masons, you should know that there is not just one Masonic ritual. There are scads of them. They're all basically the same, but they differ in many minor details. But the degrees which co-masonry works would be recognized by any masculine mason as the same degrees he is familiar with, although there are peripheral differences. As a matter of fact, that triangle, which was formed of binaries, gave birth to a lodge which was called the Dharma Lodge. And the ritual which was developed in the Dharma Lodge, based on an Old English ritual, is a ritual that all English-speaking co-Masonic lodges in the world today still use. And it's called the Dharma ritual, because that's where it started in 1903. Now, masculine Masons regard masculinity as a landmark of Masonry. The landmarks are aspects of Masonry which cannot be changed. Right? If you change them, you don't have Masonry anymore. You've got something else. Right? They are the essentials. They are the defining elements of Masonry. Masculine Masons have traditionally regarded masculinity as a landmark of Masonry. It is the position of co-Masons that that's incorrect. That Freemasonry developed with only men because it developed out of the stonemason's craft, and there were only men who were stonemasons. So it was an accident, not a landmark, a social, historical accident. All right, now, I've talked a little bit about the Ancient Mysteries. I've talked a little bit about modern Freemasonry. Do you see some parallels between the things I have talked about? I don't have to point them out. I've tried to describe them so that the parallelism would be obvious. Let me say just a quick word about what I think is the cause of those parallelisms. All human beings are basically alike. We may think that other human beings are very different from us, but basically we are all remarkably similar. Right? Among species, we are perhaps the most unified species on this planet. Our differences are superficial. And that applies not just to our physical makeup. It applies to our psychic, intellectual, spiritual makeup as well. This fact was discovered or put forth as an explanation by a Swiss psychologist by the name of Carl Jung, that I'm sure many of you are, whose name I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Carl Jung discovered in treating his patients, he had them do dream analysis the way he was a student of Freud's originally. So he had them do dream analysis, but also he had them do sketches, do artwork. You didn't have to be an artist, but just doodles, right? And then he would get them to analyze their doodles. And what he discovered was that they were doing doodles which had designs which were extremely close to certain designs in 2nd and 3rd century alchemical manuscripts. And these people had no knowledge whatever of those manuscripts or of alchemy. How do you explain this? Well, Jung came up with an explanation which he called the collective unconscious. That all human beings share a common unconscious mind. Each of us has